Hello.
Hello, Robert. Good to see you. It's good to see you. So we are streaming live on YouTube.
Okay, you're doing that.
It's on YouTube. It is cold here in South Africa. I mean, it is winter. So I understand you guys are experiencing the opposite.
Yeah, here it's a bit too. It's hot.
No, it is wonderfully cold here. Okay.
Is it supposed to be like this, or there's something? Now it must be going towards warmer.
I think we are also going through climate change here.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know.
Okay, they're having a conversation. Hey, Sabelo, how are you? Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
In the room. And Stella's here too.
Hi, Stella. How are you?
Hi, Sabelo.
Yeah, great presentation.
Thank you. I didn't know you were zooming in. Yeah, he was.
No, I was in.
What an honor. So how are you doing? Did you have your coffee?
No, we're fine here. It's so hot. It's hard even to take a coffee.
I know. I'm having ice cold water right now. Cheers.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Everybody else is having Coke. Oh. This is going to be fun.
We might be experiencing the great reversals. I mean, so the African continent might soon be known as the cold African continent.
That would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so we have about 2 minutes. Professor will then start. I see Professor Ramugondo is in. She has been in for quite a while. So, yes.
Hello.
Hi, Professor Ramugondo. I know she's.
Oh, hello, everyone.
How are you?
Ooh, the nerves with this load shedding and traffic on the road. Yeah, it was touch and go, right, to make this time.
I hope it will sustain us.
What will sustain us?
I mean, the load shedding. I hope it won't kick in and mess up things.
Yeah, no.
But Prof, you joined pretty early. I mean,
we were lucky. Really,
yes.
It was touch and go. We were lucky.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. So we'll just maybe in a minute or so, then Professor Ndluvukachene will get us started. Yeah.
2 minutes, then we start. Yeah, maybe we begin. What do you think, Bongani?
We should, yes, I think we should begin.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are. Here in Bayreuth, it is in the afternoon, and my name is Sabelo J. Ndlovukacheni. I'm here holding the chair in epistemologies of the Global South, and I'm also the Vice Dean for Research for the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. And it is our pleasure and indeed an honor to welcome you all to this fourth seminar in a series of monthly seminars on the theme of the changing idea of Africa and the future of African studies. And I must say that it is a collaborative work between my chair here at the University of Bayreuth and the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, led by Dr. Bongani Ngulunga at the University of Johannesburg. The seminars are also part of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, whose mandate is to advance the agenda of reconfiguring African studies. And as such, the seminars are also part of our regular knowledge lab, keynotes, events organized around three issues: the methodological innovations, theoretical innovations, and the reflexive African studies. This is our fourth seminar. And in this fourth seminar, we are honored and indeed privileged today to host Professor Elelwane Ramakondo from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, who is going to speak on the topic of theorizing present struggles. And to me, Professor Ramakondo is a comrade, and we have shared the stage in a number of spaces pushing the agenda of decolonization and transformation. In connection with that work, Professor Ramakondo has convened the inaugural UCT Decolonial Summer School, and he is a regular speaker at the University of KwaZulu-Natal Decolonial Summer School, where I also participated. But at the present moment, Professor Ramakondo is a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, responsible for transformation, student affairs, and social responsiveness. By profession, she is an occupational therapist, and from 2009 to 2013, she was the head of the Occupational Therapy Division at the University of Cape Town. Professor Ramakondo is a fighter for social justice and epistemic justice, and is a founding member of the University of Cape Town Black Academic Caucus, where she served as vice chairperson and a member of the executive committee until recently. Professor Ramakondo also chaired the University of Cape Town's academic committee, and from 2015, Professor Ramakondo was appointed as a special advisor on transformation to the Vice Chancellor, and was instrumental in crafting the University of Cape Town curriculum change framework, which was informed by decoloniality. And in short, because I can't actually say everything she has done, in short, today we're hosting an extensively published academic, an experienced university leader, and a very active fighter for justice. And in terms of how we are going to move forward, Professor Ramakondo will address us for a maximum of 60 minutes. Then my colleague, Dr. Bongani Ngulunga, will chair the question and the answer session. And for my part now, I need to welcome my sister, my comrade, and a leader in higher education, Professor Ramakondo, to deliver the seminar. And we are indeed very excited to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you, Professor Ndlovukacheni, for that very generous introduction. I note that, and you were holding back because there's so much to say, given what we've been through and what we continue to face. And I thank you both. So yourself as chair in epistemologies of the Global South with emphasis on Africa at the University of Beirut in Germany, and Dr. Tulunga, director of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Really thank you for thinking of me to be part of this conversation. And also thank you to everyone here, here at home, in South Africa and on the continent. I call Yonginto home. But also those from the diaspora and everyone else for taking the time to listen to the talk and to support the work of this collaboration. I have what I believe is the shortest title I've ever heard for a talk. But this is so because each word is sufficient in itself and expansive in meaning. And I'll start from right the beginning of the title, which is Theorizing. And in that, there's a question one cannot avoid, and it's this one that asks, what makes a theorist? One cannot talk about theorizing without some discussion about who counts as a theorist. And part of that discussion is aligned with contestations about who is regarded a legitimate knower and can thus also produce knowledge. But for a moment, let's first concentrate on the active word theorizing included in the title. I've also consciously chosen to focus on the act of theorizing rather than the product of such a process, that is theory. Within academic discourse, theorizing, or what is done to produce theory, is regarded a distinct scholarly practice, an endeavor that is critical for growing and deepening scholarship. Most professions and disciplines, however, pay more attention to theories that already exist rather than the actual process of producing theory. In sociology and other social sciences, for instance, Richard Swedberg noted greater emphasis on existing theories, such as those generated by Durkheim, Weber, and Bourdieu, and sustained neglect of theorizing as a scholarly enterprise. Swedberg proposes that the production of theory constitutes a two consecutive cycles process, starting with theorizing in the context of discovery, producing tentative theory, which names, describes, and explains phenomenon, followed by theorizing in the context of justification, that is, putting the tentative theory to the test. Theorizing in the context of discovery is made up of 1, observation, 2, the naming of the phenomenon of interest that arise from observation, 3, the building out of concepts and their relationships, sometimes using analogies and metaphors, and lastly 4, the formulation of a tentative theory, including explanation. I would add that there may even be a predictive element that emerges from explanation. Swedberg sees theory as work in progress, never as a definitive solution to a problem. Advocates of theorizing within the academy are also embracing of creativity, focused on how to say something new, fitting very well with the need to grow and develop disciplines, but also within the neoliberal knowledge economy, as something new becomes an immediate commodity. There's, however, also growing recognition that theorizing in the context of discovery involves improvisation and the need to rethink and to reconsider. So far, I do not think many people will disagree with what I've had to say on theorizing. Much contestation, however, arises from whether theorizing only exists within the academy and whether it is necessarily taught or individuals can learn how to theorize on their own. On the second question, I'm happy to be persuaded that it helps to get pointers from others on how to theorize. Where I would differ with many is that theorizing necessarily only takes place within the academy. My first proposition, therefore, and I know I'm not the only one who knows this, is that theorizing does happen outside of academic spaces. And here my focus is on grassroots community spaces, not corporate spaces. My second proposition is that theorizing in these spaces will be different, beginning with what can be observed, the tools for theorizing, and the purpose for which theorizing occurs. I will deal with the first two cases of difference as I continue, but let me start with purpose, as here, reasons for difference are immediately clear. Outside of academic spaces and at grassroots community levels, there is no preoccupation with founding new disciplines, advancing those that exist, or producing knowledge that can be commodified. The purpose of theorizing for these communities can sometimes simply be about remembering how things used to be and how they are no longer the same. Given predictive possibilities from theorizing, communities may sometimes very well be spot on about what the future may look like if things don't change. Note that here I emphasize community, not the individual, a community in conversation with itself. This is not to say that the individual does not contemplate the future based on current circumstances, but this contemplation is enriched in conversation with others. Traditional societies have thrived for centuries on this mode of theorizing. By juxtaposing the two, that is, theorizing within the academy and doing so outside, the idea is not to privilege one over the other. Points I want to emphasize is that what can be observed may be different, that there may very well be different tools used in these spaces, and that certainly theorizing in these spaces serves different purposes. Already here, what is signaled is that there lies great value in theorizing from both within and outside of disciplines, from inside and outside the academy. Good examples I can refer to here in South Africa is the work by Sarah Molatane Henkemann, focused on analyzing narratives of invisible or visible violence and trauma, and the work by Tshepo Madlingozi on neo-apartheid constitutionalism, which draws heavily on the lived experiences of Abahlali baseMjondolo, or Abahlali for short, a 20-plus-year-old, approximately 10,000 strong social movement of shack dwellers. Swedberg gives us a powerful pointer on theorizing by noting that theorizing always begins with observation. I would also like to add witnessing to this. And we can talk about the difference between observation and witnessing, perhaps during the Q&A session. But on what is different about observation within and outside the academy, we have to start with the fact that within the academy, what is observed becomes data, which is then managed within certain methodological constraints. Outside of the academy, phenomena to be observed or witnessed constitutes everyday, intergenerationally lived experiences in context. Of course, anyone can observe or witness. It is how they observe as part of theorizing or what they do with what they've witnessed that matters. Crucial is that the observer or one who witnesses has time for contemplation. Coloniality robs society and whole communities of time. Time to contemplate, to reflect. Poor communities in their quest for survival bear the brunt for this. The brunt of this. But neoliberal enslavement has extended much of the scarcity of time to the working class and their children. Also, the indebted who are primed to always strive for upward mobility. Getting one's contemplations published makes visible who counts as a thinker and perhaps a theorist in the making within neoliberal society. This is where publication platforms always play a key role in determining who's a legitimate thinker or not, advancing or thwarting what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls global cognitive justice. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, privilege gets you published, without which many turn to self-publishing if they have the means, or social media platforms as the only place where they can think out loud and make sense of situations they witness in the real world. And I've noticed that many of you here are those kinds of theorists using social media, often Facebook, to think out loud. I'm sure Stella Nyanzi will have a lot to say about that experience and many, many others. Of course, we know that those with ample time and deep pockets usually mine these reflections towards their own ends. And of course, there's an important issue of language, especially considering Ngugi wa Thiong'o's strong assertion that colonial languages effectively starve the imagination of the colonized, robbing them of the possibility to imagine a different future from what colonization has already set in motion. One disruptive and generative space on social media in this regard exists in Black Twitter, where much contemplation about current circumstances, both locally and globally, sometimes happens in people's home languages, languages other than English, French, or any of the Germanic languages. Having to theorize using a colonial language and lacking time to do so effectively, of course, is a burden the colonized contemporary academic has to bear. The academy also often arrogates to itself soul powers and abilities for observation, and sometimes stands in the way, particularly when those within the academic space seek to connect with their own communities. My experience in this regard came when I sought to locate my doctoral work in a rural community of my childhood, where people speak my home language, Chivenda, in the northern part of Limpopo. Curious about continuities and discontinuities in play within family, I planned to spend a month each with 3 families, with a significant part of that work being ethnographic, and with participant observation being key. One hurdle towards gaining ethics approval from my academic institution was one reviewer's concerns that my data collection method would be too intrusive for these families. In responding, to the review panel, I found that I needed to problematize the Western conception of privacy, citing a story involving a clinic outreach program in another rural community where patients were more comfortable consulting medical personnel with a curtain separating them from accompanying family members and other community members than a closed door. This example illustrated that sometimes communities trust each other than even trained medical professionals. This was a community that, of course, the community that I was planning to spend time with, that knew me very well and also knew my parents. So the panel, given my response, was persuaded so I could proceed. Suffice to say that after word got around about my research topic, I found that families invited me to spend the time with them. I did not have to ask. In one family, after a few days of fieldwork, the father said to me, "Erwani, I see what you see." And I asked him to elaborate, and he said, "I don't see myself in my children. And this is only one generation later. We're doomed." As he said this, tears rolled down his cheeks. I was maybe late 20s, early 30s at the time. And this was someone who had retired. So it wasn't someone my age who was brought to tears, beginning to grapple with what he realized I was keen on understanding. So these continuities and discontinuities in play across generations for me and the families that I was engaging with, and ultimately what I was able to make sense of is how these continuities and discontinuities tell a story about how traditional society is navigating rapid social change, revealing that play, in fact, is not benign, that play can become a tool that modernity uses effectively to co-opt communities, whole neighborhoods, and society broadly into a capitalist and consumerist trajectory. Another story involves a postgraduate student of mine from Eswatini, also seeking approval from the ethics committee. And her interest was sparked by having observed that in her community, there were some games that she grew up playing that she continued to observe. So she was interested in developing a checklist for these games in relation to what they provide for holistic human development. And again, the concern that was raised was, how could she have already developed a list? Does this mean that she has already started collecting data without ethics approval? In going back and providing a rebuttal, I simply asked the question, does this student need your permission in order to notice what is already in her environment? That question alone was enough for the panel to reconsider. But of course, there can also be dangers in grassroots spaces outside the academy intersecting with the academy. Sylvia Winter observed that the 15th century secularizing intellectual revolution of Renaissance humanists, which was mounted in large part from the counter perspective of the lay intelligentsia, came about because these lay intelligentsia of medieval Europe had found themselves in a situation where, in order to be learned and regarded accomplished scholars, they had to be accomplices in the production of a politics of truth. that subordinated their own lay world and its perspective on reality to that of the church and of the clergy, which had defined the human as primarily the religious subject of the church. Of course, here, the clergy and the church had subsumed in both form and content the academy within the context of the then hegemonic scholastic order of knowledge in medieval Europe. Now, moving to the second term, present, and my reflections here will be very brief. So by present, in my formulation, I don't want to be understood to be talking about temporality, because to do so would lock us into a Western conception of linear time, where there's a past, present, and future in consecutive terms. And I find a helpful reconfiguration of time instead being one suggested by Frank Wilderson in his political memoir, Incognero, a memoir of exile and apartheid, where he suggests that when we think of time outside of white cultural imperialism, time begins to behave like the ocean, and 500 years is simultaneously this minute. And to speak of present, for me, rather than current or now, for instance, is to also register that what happens in life is felt. And here we begin to acknowledge the centrality of the body. Now I'll move on to struggle. And as I was developing my thoughts and putting these thoughts on paper, I realized how theorizing present struggle and talking about it was quite an ambitious task. Most human beings in the world are struggling with something. While this is not necessarily new, as many of the factors that inform those struggles are perennial and ultimately point to global unequal power relations, somehow these struggles, such as deepening inequality in accessing food security, safe transportation, secure shelter and electricity, quality education, and decent health, feel more acute. What is beginning to emerge in making sense of these struggles is the role of the global elites and their ability to subvert national sovereignty, to corrupt government agencies such that they are no longer able to fulfill their regulatory functions, and to interfere with the exercise of press and academic freedom. We are seeing increasingly institutions in crisis where the public is beginning to question their legitimacy and authority as thought leaders and custodians of public values and goods. So, given such an ambitious task, it was important that I became selective. And my point of selecting from where to theorize was it landed me in the body bio-geopolitical epistemic position from whence to theorize. And I chose blackness. I use blackness here as a metaphor rather than a biological category. A metaphor in the same sense that De Sousa Santos uses the South not as a geographical term, but a metaphor for the unjust suffering caused by capitalism and past and contemporary forms of colonialism. From this perspective, anyone who is part of collectives or populations that have suffered in a systematic way the unjust realities of colonialism and capitalism is Black. Yeah, sorry, suffered in a systemic way, these injustices. Key in this construction of Blackness is registering suffering as experienced by and or in the body, and the body indistinct from the mind and soul, consequently becoming the site of resistance and healing. It is here that theorizing becomes a life or death endeavor, intergenerational, without which we remain dead. And I wish to posit that African studies presents a generative space for theorizing. As an interdisciplinary field, African studies offers hope that people of Africa and the African diaspora will have their histories, cultures, and politics fairly represented through scholarship and their humanity restored. The promise of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity lies in the possibility to transcend conventional disciplines, concepts, methods, and conceptual frameworks towards tackling societal problems. So I see my invitation to speak at this platform as an affirmation that my scholarship and praxis is seen as interdisciplinary in orientation. And I must say, during my intensive teaching days, I earned the name Eclectic Elwani because any discipline that provided a framework that helped expand our thinking was welcome. Of course, theorizing from a place of Blackness will attract criticism. Often this entails reducing the work to a narrow form of identity politics. Engaging this criticism is an aspect of theorizing present struggle from a place of Blackness. What we observed during 2015 and 2016 were strong attempts to mute Rose Must Fall activism in all its expressions. And Rose Must Fall student activists at UCT were often framed as anti-intellectual, fitting the usual racist trope of Black bodies lacking in rational thought and agency, in contrast with Antonio Gramsci and Edward Said's insistence that intellectualism, rather than being a function of cognitive processes alone, is in fact an expression of intellectual thought in persistent dialogue with a commitment towards equality and justice as material goals for society. In our work as part of the Curriculum Change Working Group, which produced the UCT Curriculum Change Framework, which you heard my brother refer to in the introduction, we were attacked for suggesting that our work was rightly Black-led. This, even in a context of historic Black exclusion. Beyond that, we were criticized for not advancing a clear, cohesive theory of curriculum change. Strangely, those who regard themselves curriculum experts had over decades failed to produce such a theory, and yet we were supposed to produce it within just over a year, even as we were engaged in struggle over how to decolonize curricula during active protest. Here, what we see is theorizing in struggle being forced into hasty abstraction, deduction, and generalization. And there are many strategies that are used to mute theorizing in struggle. Toni Morrison reminds us of how destruction works. And she says, the very serious function of racism is destruction. It keeps us from doing our work. It keeps us explaining over and over again our reason for being. If we're not distracted, we're often redirected. Many are pointed towards some other theory, or conversely lambasted over why they are adopting theories from elsewhere. So we are not even allowed to import or borrow, for instance, intersectionality, critical race theory, even if there are synergies between experiences in North America and over here, or wherever we draw theories that we find useful from. If not redirected, we are misinterpreted. And there are many options, all towards ultimate invisibilization. To dismantle the criticism around identity as a place from where to start theorizing struggle, we have to expose the fallacy about the possibility of thinking without the body. This is a key fallacy that has endured empiricist perspectives in the social sciences, including African studies. This fallacy rides on the tailcoats of a long-esteemed goal for the Western-led pursuit of knowledge to yield universally agreed upon truths. While René Descartes is credited with being the father of mind-body dualism based on his seminal work, Discourse on the Method, and his famous dictum, Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, Jerry Jennings argues that this dualism, in fact, emerged as a secondary byproduct of Descartes' original goal of establishing what should count as knowledge, an epistemological question. The problem starts when Descartes posits that there are two distinct entities, the thinking mind and extended matter or body, to be understood separately before one can understand how they interact. This ontological preconception about the mind and the body existing as separate entities laid the basis for the method Descartes adopted in his phenomenological analysis of rational thought. He then formulated a set of qualities that necessarily define mental being or existence as non-bodily, episodic, autonomous from external influence, having different modes and able to recognize itself as engaged in various mental acts. In adopting a strict method, which required him to experience mental existence as being fully attentive and self-aware, Descartes contradicted his own observation that real life experiences and feelings such as pain, hunger, and thirst remind him that the essence of who he is does not only reside within the body, and I quote, a pilot in his ship, but that he is intimately connected with it, the body, and that the mixture is so blended that something like a single whole is produced, close quote. Notwithstanding criticism, Cartesian dualism continues to pervade the pursuit of knowledge, at least from a Eurocentric perspective. It thus becomes critical to elucidate what this persistence is a function of, or what it attempts to hide. Sendyuhira suggests that the answer to this question lies in how Eurocentric knowledge thrives or strives to separate the knower and their judgment from understanding reality. By doing so, Eurocentric epistemology allows for the production of lies as objective knowledge. And to drive this point home, Hira uses the concept of discovery as an example. Here, different from Swedbeck's generative use of the concept in the context of theorizing, discovery is the sole privilege of those who conquered within the mode of colonization. This notion of discovery that is linked to conquest is strongly embedded within the narrative of science and Western civilization as the triumph of humanity, even where everywhere explorers landed all over the world from Europe. What is called discovery has a counter narrative from indigenous people. It is called occupation. The question we then need to ask is whether lived experience is indeed antithetical to the idea of the academy or the university. Is it really all experience, or is it some people's experience? And the answer to this question lies in whose experiences continue to be centered within the canon across disciplines. And I will leave that to everyone here to interrogate within their own disciplines, including African studies. The interrogation must include whether Blackness is ever centered and in what form. Are Black people merely objects of study, or are they centered as subjects? The last part of my paper will focus on why theorizing from the place of Blackness is crucial. Firstly, I will remind you that Blackness never mattered, and still doesn't matter. Secondly, that theorizing around struggle from a place of Blackness is necessarily different. And lastly, that given the different nature of theorizing arising from Blackness, the story of humanity is incomplete without it. To show how Blackness never mattered, it helps to go back to the story of humanism briefly. Humanism emerged in Western Europe during the 17th century, declared the Age of Reason, and grew during the 18th century. Ironically, this period followed 2 centuries during which white Christian settlers led the European expansion, spearheaded in part by Christopher Columbus in 1492, who erroneously landed in the Americas, believing it was India. While the colonization and land grab of the Americas was largely driven by the civilizing project centered on Christianizing the Indians, whose refusal would lead to them being murdered, the Atlantic captive human trade was primarily driven by Europe, Britain, and North America, building themselves economically, laying the foundation for how they became dominant global superpowers today. The religious racism, which found expression through convert or I kill you for the Indians, mirrors the color racism that helped justify the capturing of Africans to serve empire. This color racism became the predecessor of the eugenics movement, which advanced scientific or biological racism. That is the pseudoscientific belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify racism and racial inferiority or superiority. Coined during the 1800s by Francis Galton, the term eugenics, which is Greek for good birth, inspired the eugenics movement throughout the progressive era towards the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, coinciding with the founding of many academic disciplines. Sylvia Wynter knows that given these theorizing conditions around which medieval Latin Christian Europe self-realized its own humanity, the West would therefore remain unable from then on to conceive of an other to what it calls human. Now, let me remind you as well that Blackness still doesn't matter. I'm gonna try and share a PowerPoint, might take a while. So I'm sure you can see it now. Yeah. You are probably all familiar with the line of the human as informed by Fanon, with others like Sylvia Wynter, Lewis Gordon, Ramon Grossfugel, and others helping articulate the dynamics further. We've also found that it helps to present this as a graphic. The space above the racialized line of being human depicts the zone of being, and the space below the zone of non-being, portraying a global superiority, inferiority, hierarchy, and dynamic. In the zone of being, which is linked to whiteness, humanity is regarded a given. In the zone of non-being, linked to Blackness, humanity is always under question. The dominant way of handling social conflicts in the zone of being manifests materially through regulation and emancipation, and other oppressions such as classism, sexism, and ableism are mitigated by racial privilege. Whereas in the zone of non-being, conflicts are dominantly responded to through violence and dispossession, and other oppressions are aggravated by racial oppression. Above the line of the human, there's also hyperhumanization, while below the line, premature death is often certain. A powerful illustration of premature death in the zone of non-being comes from accounts from Abahlali entitled Unfreedom Day 2014, We Mourn 20 Years of Unfreedom. And I quote, 20 years after apartheid, we live like pigs in the mud. Our children die of diarrhea. We are forced into transit camps at gunpoint. The police beat and shoot us in the streets, and the assassins kill us with impunity. If we stand up and demand that our humanity is recognized, we are removed from the housing list and placed on the death list. From this, Madlingozi reflects that even under conditions of constitutional democracy, a culture of human rights, most pertinently the hegemonic discourse of social justice, if you are poor and Black, you still can be killed with immunity. Another illustration comes through these vivid images depicting what hyperhumanization allows and what premature death looks like. These were both protest situations, one in Senegal, where white South Africans with strong allegiance to Afrikaner were showing their dissatisfaction with the justice system. And the other, Marikana, where mine workers were protesting around wages. I'm gonna stop sharing if I can. Let me see. My own observations are that even if one is not poor, but nonetheless Black, premature death becomes a real possibility. One matters as long as one does not challenge the status quo. Between the poor Black and the elite Black who challenges the status quo, it is the manner of death that becomes of significant or material difference. It is perhaps not police brutality for the Black elite, but something else, which accompanies the mirage of upward mobility. That one matters as a Black person has a limit. It is borrowed time. Again, one matters as long as one does not challenge the status quo. Here we're talking about co-option of Blackness into the zone of being. Again, Madlingozi calls this incorporation, which means extending human rights to the historically dehumanized as part of reconstituting political society and of reconfiguring civil society, which functions to seduce historical victims of social exclusion and anti-Black racism into teleological whiteness, the idea that being white and the attainment of whiteness are the highest ideals of emancipation and human progress. Here, emancipation is merely a mirage, what Abahlali call unfreedom. The extension of unfreedom from Abahlali to the rest of Black South Africa, for instance, is perhaps best captured by Ndumiso Dladla as he unpacks how our present constitution, unlike earlier versions, enjoys the status of supreme law. He posits that it was not until Black people were finally able to have a say in the political and legal order of South Africa that Parliament was subjected to a constitution in order to limit its exercise of popular power. He shows that in addition to the subversion of customary law to Roman Dutch and English laws and the Eurocentrism of South African jurisprudence, this constitution violates well-established principles of justice, even within Western law and philosophy. One principle he highlights in this regard is one that says a legal right or entitlement cannot arise from an unlawful act or omission, or is relative, that a wrongdoer should not be enabled by law to take any advantage from his actions. Dladla contends that the Constitution violates these principles through its fundamentalization of the right to property. A pertinent question he then asks is this: if one considers that under colonialism and apartheid after it, a combined period of more than 350 years, the European conqueror and his posterity acquired property through the seizing of the indigenous people's land and property. The question is, who exactly had property to protect in 1996? In other words, precisely whose property was being protected by the Constitution? In Dadla's analysis, the right to property in South Africa as enshrined in our Constitution is a logical and practical extension of the right of conquest. Now, on theorizing around struggle from a place of Blackness being necessarily different, I've already alluded to strategies used to thwart the very act of theorizing from a place of Blackness. That is, denying Black-centered theorizing, being forced into hasty abstraction, deduction, and generalization, distraction, misdirection or redirection, misinterpretation, etc. This constitutes one aspect of struggle in theorizing from a place of Blackness. The second aspect is teleological and begs the question, struggle towards what? My assertion is that theorizing present struggle from a place of Blackness is towards liberation, total liberation, political, economic, mental, intellectual, epistemic, social, cultural, and spiritual. Liberation is the opposite of domination or dependency, which are two sides of the same coin. This is not a struggle towards dominating others or inverting dependency. It is essentially a struggle towards coexistence, coexistence of all in diversity and full ontological density. And of course, this coexistence applies to other beings. And this is for Black people, not a struggle towards recognition by whiteness. Recognition is a trap, entailing co-option or incorporation, if we go with Madlinguzi. So in this work, who and what should inspire us? For my own work, liberation philosophers such as Steve Biko, Dussel, and Fanon were critical in giving me an understanding around consciousness as a mental attitude and a commitment to fight all forms of domination. It helped me coin the term occupational consciousness from my own disciplinary background as a recognition that what we do every day is the most powerful way to perpetuate dominant practices or to disrupt them. Another source of inspiration is Pan-Africanism, even when, as Shosekesi notes, Pan-Africanism is filled often with contradictions. In drawing from Pan-Africanism, we must strive to invoke the voices of women who have played a role in its history and development, but until recently were effectively erased. Women like Alice Victoria Kinloch, Audley Moore, Dara Abubakari, and Charlotte Matseke. Of course, in my paper, I've referred often to activists, mostly Abahlali baseMjondolo, Rose Must Fall, but there are many others. Just ourselves here today, we have many movements that we draw from, that we engage with, that we walk along with to inspire how we theorize struggle. We also draw inspiration from the arts, acknowledging the role of the arts and Black aesthetics, for instance, in inspiring movements such as negritude. In the late 1970s, hip hop emerged and was described as a Pan-African state of mind. Here in South Africa, we know of the role of art and music in the minds from immigrant laborers, displaced from family, overworked and underpaid. The gumboot dance and maskandi, which today finds some expression in contemporary Amapiano. Our own ancestors give us inspiration in many ways. And for me, particularly, what I always gravitate towards is how our ancestors survived over centuries, what they did to survive. We draw inspirations from indigenous practices. One of my current doctoral PhD students is doing this kind of work, exploring the consciousness of Ngoma. That's Nkosinati Oela, rich with what he has observed and witnessed. We also draw inspiration from insights that are hidden in indigenous languages. Another current PhD candidate of mine, Thabisa Chadisa, doing important work in this regard, drawing from African literature to decolonize curricula and expanding what we have always understood as the male voice in literary works and identifying feminist scholars of literary works. To conclude, my strong assertion is that the world needs theorizing present struggle from places of Blackness. Otherwise, the story of our global shared humanity will always be incomplete. This is how we expand the Knowledge Project. Also, without doing this, the next time injustices Blackness has grown accustomed to reach Europe, we will again remind the world that perhaps the chickens are coming home to roost. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Ramakudu. Thank you so much for the, for lack of a better term, what I will call a generous offering, intellectual offering in this space, which I think everyone really appreciated. And we will move straight to Bongani to facilitate the next session.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lobukacheni. Thank you, Professor Ramukondo, for the wonderful lecture. Colleagues, as we usually do, this is now our fourth lecture. I mean, any comments, questions, you can write them on the chat or raise your hand to ask a question. So the floor is open. We have about 45 minutes to an hour for a discussion. So we'll welcome any comments. Yes. Yes, Monty Makachi, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. If you can start. Monte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Greetings from Toronto, Canada. I'm on my iPad, so I do not have visual audio, so you'll just be hearing me viva voce. My compliments to an inspiring, engaged, intellectual presentation. And if I were to offer a comment, it is specific to Fanon. And I represent this because for the past 5 years, I have been toing and froing from Toronto to Kinshasa. And in less than 2 weeks, I will be back in Congo. And as you can appreciate, the situation in DRC is astringent. And now referencing to your commentary vis-a-vis South Africa and how those lacking voice are being perjured and subsumed by those who exercise power privilege, albeit not necessarily responsibly, I pose this to you. Based on what you have seen, based on what you have read, based on what you are feeling, what are your projections for the future specific to South African political, social, economic publics? Notwithstanding that right now, South Africa is in a state of what I call, in a sense, tremulous, that is teetering, that there is a great deal of mistrust among many peoples to how government is using the state public resources. And I thank you.
Thank you, Monte. Before you answer, perhaps, Professor Ramukondo, let us go to Linda. Linda, you have the floor.
Hi. Okay, let me just switch on the camera as well. It's not just Linda, it's all of us here from the previous ICDL lecture. Stella Nancy is here as well, and my entire GDO crew. Prof. Ramagundo, thank you so much. We are big fans of your work, and what you said here resonated with us. A question that I have is that you just pointed out the necessity and the importance of considering theorization from Black spaces, Black contexts, and Black places. And if this theorization is not done, then knowledge production is incomplete. My question is then, from an intersectional perspective, and also from a perspective of interrogating the colonialities of gender from that intersectional perspective, what does one then do when doing especially intersectional scholarship from in the area of African studies, if African scholars from continental perspectives and contexts say Blackness is not relevant in Africa, in African spaces, because it is only in specific diasporic spaces that an African person would then encounter Blackness and have Blackness thrust upon them, as it were. That criticism is something that is quite frequent, and it opens up space for dissonance. And I'm sure we could try to make that space open to productive dissonance. How do we then address this question of Blackness if it is being disavowed as a valuable space of knowledge production? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Linda and the colleagues over there. Professor Ramukondo, if you can respond to the two questions.
So taking a leaf from, I think in particular, Prof. Ndovu Gacheni, who always resists answering and always says in these spaces it should be a conversation. I think it will open up more voices, more engagement, and make this a generative space rather than a monologue from me engaging provocations from the room. I'm hoping that anyone here who sees a gap in what I have contributed in response to those provocations doesn't hold back and can indicate. So I'm trying to I'll start with the last question from Linda, and thank you. It's always, yeah, there's always a big warm feeling when you see a collective of women sitting together. There's power in that we find that we're not walking the journey alone. It's yes, it's a community in conversation with itself that generates questions, thinking, theorizing, and this is where we heal. I can't help but go back to images of what many of us witnessed of Stella's journey. Yeah, in confronting political power and the violence that comes with that. And if I understood you correctly, you asking around the disavowing of voice from people who are on the continent, with the suggestion that you only have your Blackness attacked when you are elsewhere in the diaspora. And I think it's a common mistake in that often we think of power and legitimacy to be in relation to numbers. So the numerical majority on the continent, it's often misread as a source of power, when we in fact know that coloniality has created a situation where we are many, and especially if you think about women and how many we are, if you count, we are a cultural minority by far. But politically, and this relates to the earlier question, the hegemony of imperial influence, politically, economically, culturally, is one that we feel. It's one that leads to what you describe in the DRC. We saw with the Ukraine situation, for instance, how even the narrative was a reminder that a victim that is seen, especially on mainstream media, needs to be white. Forgetting that what was being seen in Ukraine was really a mirror of what Africa sees often. It took strong voices from the continent beginning to hold the mirror to say, are you watching yourself? Are you seeing yourselves? And when I talk about chickens coming home to roost, it's in that mode that you tolerate injustices, including genocide, elsewhere. You only fool yourself when you think that it won't come close to home. So I don't believe that any of us can have a projection about how Africa will look like in the next few years without thinking about how Europe, how North America, how China, including Russia, and what is going on will be implicated in many ways. So we can't think of Africa and African politicians separate from what is plotted in Europe by the global elite. We have seen how there is increasingly a centralized space of making decisions around major crises, whether it's the pandemic or climate crises. And this is where I talk about the sovereignty question. For Africa, we've known that our sovereignty has always been seen as a threat, and it's always been tempered with. But increasingly, we're seeing this as a global phenomenon. So we are entangled. What future we will see in Africa will, in many ways, be an expression of global politics.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Any questions? I see we have some questions on our chat. One of them is from Stephen Tuff. The question is work by white allies, such as myself, critiquing coloniality, domination, in actuality a colonizing act of privileged people? Recognizing, let's see. So that is one question. Recognizing Black and other oppressed peoples, because critiques of coloniality still take the oppressed as an object. And then perhaps let us take, if you could just note that, Professor, and then we take a question from Nikki Ware.
Thank you. Your talk was really inspiring. And then I wondered that about, we as academics have all these spaces where we talk about decolonization of the education system, about Black consciousness and all these things. But then we are talking about people who probably don't have access to all these academic papers that we publish about such subjects. How do we communicate to the masses? Because we as academics can talk and publish, but the majority of the people to whom this is most useful to do not have access to this. I like that you spoke about art, you spoke about music, these are the forms of platforms that we can use to communicate our academic work to the masses. But are we really doing that, as academics? Are we really investing our time and energies and resources to collaborate? I like that you also mentioned transdisciplinarity. You defined it as, involving alternate disciplines, collaborating with them to produce this knowledge. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I hope this makes sense. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really inspiring.
Yes, to you, Prof.
So I'll start with the first question on the work of allies. I mean, this question always arises whenever we focus on Blackness. And it's an ongoing conversation at home without saying too much. You know, because if you are partners in life and you share a political project, but you know, you are racialized as Black or white, and then, you know, there's work to be done where Blackness is centered. You can only imagine that the other half we will always have a question mark, and it helps because it helps us clarify for ourselves how we support each other, but also support the political project in ways that do not undermine what you raise as a concern, where Black people who may very well be a focus in the struggle for someone who's not Black, how they're not reduced to objects, and it's for me it revolves around this idea of coexistence, right? Coexistence means sharing space, sharing what we all have inherited as humans, with one not having to think that they are needed for the other to be fully human. You know, this idea that I need to do for in order to elevate your humanity. It's where we often go wrong, because letting go of that need to save, but not getting in the way when the other that has been dispossessed, oppressed over time, says, I am here and I am here on my terms. If that doesn't unsettle the ally, then we're good. Because often it is where Blackness finds expression from a place of power. And I mean here power as in knowing who you are and speaking with confidence about what you see as your heritage, how you express that heritage, but also the demands for total liberation, political, economic, all those spheres that I mentioned. If the ally is not unsettled by those demands, then we're okay. So there's a lot of work for allies on themselves, right? To ask the question, why is it that they need? Why is it that they need? So the why question, what cultivated this kind of existence such that I am needed, and begin to engage with history and question where colonial tendencies continue even today. That's where it starts. Because often the gesture is a patronizing one. It's a helping hand, creating dependency, which obviously works to elevate and create the same superior-inferiority dynamic that we are trying to address. And what we have seen is that there's this anxiety whenever voice finds itself and says, this is who I am, and this is how I want to exist on my terms. That the ability to tolerate that voice is a helpful starting point. Now, the second question on conversations. I've had a sobering moment not too long ago, where I asked myself the question, how well does my own family...
Ah ja, okay. Ja gut, ja, das ist
Rutika, just mute yourself, please.
It happens often.
Apologize.
It happens often. Yeah, so the question, how much does my own family, I'm talking about where I grew up, I'm talking about nephews and nieces, how much do they know what it is that I do? Have we had the conversation such that they can see that what I'm doing has anything to do with their lives, their struggles, right? It's a very important starting point, because immediately you begin to connect with areas of life that have everything to do with you. And where I come from, I am Makazi with almost 17 nephews and nieces. Some with qualifications, unemployed, right? One of them having worked in the city of Johannesburg under very difficult circumstances as a paramedic. The one excruciating story he shared with me, after suffering what you could diagnose it as PTSD, he described scraping organic matter, including brain tissue from the tarmac, right? And then realizing life can't be this, right? Bodily tissue, probably from someone his age, right? And it was in the conversation that some of the concepts that we use in academia, when we begin to unpack them in ways that your own kinship, your own flesh and blood can understand and apply in their own lives and begin a life trajectory that you can look at and even envy. I mean, this young man has gone back to rural living and is beginning to experiment with ways of self-reliance and self-sustenance that we often dream about, right? And a political being in fullness, but without the terms, right? Until we spoke and we began to map our register in understanding his predicament. I mean, there was in the conversation and the borrowing of these terms and bringing them into our conversation, I began to realize that this divide between the academy and the people when you begin to engage with it. I mean, of course, when you have movements, political movements, where there's a culture of reading, we're talking, that's a different conversation. And for me, that is a generative space on its own. But I often find that in political movements, English still dominates, right? So if you have political movements, Marxist traditions, whatever it is that they're drawing from, you will be locked in, theorizing in a language that is foreign. But when you begin to have conversations with people that you call family, especially younger people, but again, you know, emphasizing the intergenerational conversations. As I was speaking, you might have noted that at some point I sort of lost focus. It was because my aunt had walked in to listen. This is an aunt who went only up to grade 2 in schooling. But I find that I can have a conversation, bringing in some of these theoretical frameworks and unpacking them in ways that she understands. So I think we often shortchange ourselves when we don't start with the people we can access. And yeah, so I've highlighted 2 spaces, family, but also political and social movements of struggle, where there's a culture of reading and debate. They are still there. So I mean, in South Africa, often we think of these political parties that are prominent, but there are many social movements that have a tradition of reading, debate, and theorizing.
Prof, thank you for those responses. I mean, these are the last questions. I know we've been at it for quite a while. Maybe before I come to you, Katu, there is a question on the chat asking you, Prof, if you could reflect on the idea of post-apartheid as a struggle and what alternative conceptual, I suppose, idea may be beneficial in articulating the present Black struggles in South Africa. So that is one question. If you could think about that while Katu is posing his question. Katu, the floor is yours.
Lokobera.
Madekwan.
Karads.
Bingo.
Good evening, Prof, and everyone else. My heart is in a right place right now. With your last statement just now, Prof, what you were mentioning that as families, we do not understand part of the things that knowledge tanks operate, to an extent that we aspire for a lot to achieve a lot, but the level of theorizing which is done at a superfluous way, at a superfluous level, does not inspire us to want to do something closer to that. Point in case is I'm a farmer, and I went back into farming because I felt that the education system, the way knowledge is being developed, does not speak to me, does not speak to my background of a farmer growing up on a tractor. And now when the subject of theorizing came about, I thought, could it be that we need to look at it from a different perspective? And indeed, what you've just highlighted talks to why I went back into farming, to really understand how do we create sustainable economies when the people that are supposed to be planning and rationing supply and services are still prefacing their knowledge based on what they were told, which was theorized at a different level? And how do we begin to understand our own backgrounds to be able to theorize the solutions that we require from a perspective of how will it benefit my immediate communities, whether it's in politics, whether it's in academics, whether it's in economic development, or whether it's in research. Now, where I'm going and what I would want you to touch on is how do we bring about the level, the element of theorizing, not only at a PhD level, but all the way down to an undergraduate level, and begin to say, those like me that ran away at masters, continue, do that research and write, but start thinking about how do you theorize? How do you see us really bringing in a mass exodus of young people to start theorizing and build a body of knowledge? Thank you.
So you can go ahead and answer those questions. Professor, I said these are really the last questions, and Professor Ndlovu Kacheni will come at them.
No, thank you. I mean, with the first question, at least, you know, in relation to where I was drawing from, I hope you have a pointer in you know, abahlali basemjondolo, and how they've really shown how we critique life in so-called post-apartheid South Africa, and with a scholar in Sepo Madlingozi really articulating that work in his own conception of you know, constitutionalism, and how in many ways it's an expression of neo-colonialism. So it's you're not left without a place to go in broadening your thinking, and critiquing what otherwise is a dominant narrative, and it's not easy to push back when you have you know, many who want to celebrate post 1994 and make South Africa a poster child of reconciliation. It's not easy because you will get I want to say pushback because it's a lighter form of violence, but you can have even violent responses because there are powerful bodies that benefit from the system as is, because it's, you know, when we talk about patronage in our political formations, we often think of the Black politicians, and we often don't think about the private sector and those who still are in control of the economy, and how they make available the resources for patronage, and the mainstream media also doesn't help. You know, the conversations that we hear, at least here in South Africa, every day about who can save us. It's very clear. You have to go to the private sector with a begging bowl. They will solve problems for all of us, and so it's difficult, but it's the critique has to be done. if it's not done, yeah, we have to worry about those who think and their mental state. You know, when you cannot express critique based on how you are analyzing your circumstances, what do you think happens there? I mean, I look at the high levels of addiction currently, and I'm reminded of what we witnessed during the 70s into the early 80s, before 1994, and when we probably didn't think that we'll ever get to a point where we vote as Black people in South Africa. So you had young people who were, doing what they felt needed to be done, and really putting themselves on the line, their bodies on the line. But you had older people who were not okay, and many of them great thinkers. Some were our teachers. And the level of addiction back then, but also it was based on what was available, right? It was alcohol. But now you're seeing much more of an epidemic, alcohol and it's for me, it ties very closely with lack of space and freedom to express critique. You turn against yourself, because how else do you explain the fact that your lot are condemned? Your lot is condemned, not only the living, but the future. If you can't critique and say, I see the problem here and this is where I can exercise my agency to correct what I see, what are you left with? Yeah, but I hope just pointing to pointers in what I shared in the paper today, in how we critique this post-apartheid moment. Yeah, I hope that is useful. Katu, you're asking a very difficult question because I mean I get depressed at times, and I'm not using the word depression lightly. When I have to confront the fact that we have become dependent to the level that even what we eat can be taken away. Even what we eat can be taken away. Threats of food security being under pressure were used by some politicians in South Africa in efforts to rally us in support of Ukraine. I mean, I'm sure you remember that conversation. Grain shortage. and because we have to be afraid that we will run out of grain, we must join the war. So food security for me, I mean, of course, land has the spiritual significances. I mean, women and what we do with land, and for some who give birth, and where the afterbirth goes and what it does to the soil to enrich it, right? There's a lot of work there, and I think there are some pointers from parts of the continent, also in India, where people are pushing back against this dependency on food produce, even seeds that can be patented, that cannot sustain production. I mean, this is a whole topic, and I don't want to get into trouble because we talk about addiction in relation to consciousness altering agents, but there's addiction also in relation to what we eat, right? That otherwise could be called food, but it's the food that makes you sick. We're seeing more and more of that. I had a conversation recently with a young person who has a PhD in agriculture. It was fascinating. She was applying for a position at some university I won't mention. And so she was talking about pesticides and how climate change is changing, how pesticides must be used, and how pests are developing ways to deal with climate change, hence the need to change pesticides. And I asked a simple question about what she knows. Her grandparents were eating. I mean, just 2 generations back. And then she had a light bulb moment. A light bulb moment. Because she was, my goodness, there's something about these things that they were growing and were eating that somehow is resilient to climate change. But because she was taught within a certain framework, she couldn't remember, right? So this is, when we talk about sometimes, all it takes in communities is remembering. 2 generations ago, different diet completely, a different crop, and resilience in that crop. Yeah, there's a lot there. I hope I've touched sufficiently on
Brother Bongani, just as a follow-up there, but it won't necessitate a response. But isn't this where we now begin to see the relevance of IKS, the indigenous the vendor in me is coming out.
Yes.
That one. In terms of us trying to theorize our solutions, and the person you were talking to is right. The pests Lamalanga are so resistant to what has been developed by the chemical companies to try and give us something to keep on going, keep on coming, literally. You don't do a soil test anymore these days without them giving you a program of what kind of chemicals you need to be putting in there. You look at it and you're like, we're already framed. And then you go out and you, for example, you want to grow your business, you want funding. They want a fertilizer program that is already framed from a perspective of dependency, literally. And indeed, maybe JIAS and yourselves, we could find a way to start talking around food security and framing this going forward. But not because agriculture is fashionable, but because agriculture is real. And if we do not have that sorted and the right people that thinking, we're going to have problems. Anyways, thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much. Before I give it back to Professor Ndlovu-Gacheni to give his voice, to give the vote of thanks, I just want to advertise 3 upcoming events in this series. The next one is by Professor Walter Mignolo, who will speak on second thoughts on Africa in the colonial horizon of modernity. That will be our next event on the 25th of August. 25th of August is Professor Mignolo, who's our next speaker. Then after that, it will be Professor Shireen Hassim. I saw she was here. She was attending the event today. She will be speaking on the 22nd of September. And the title of her talk will be Genealogies of Feminism in Africa. So that will be on the 22nd of September. And then the last event I would like to advertise, there will be others coming after that, is by Professor Ayo Kohli. I was at Dartmouth College, and she will be speaking on the idea of Africa, time and queer meditations. And that will be on the 20th of October. So those are the three next lectures. So the next one will be, just to repeat, it will be on the 25th of August by Professor Walter Mignolo. Professor Kacheni, if you can give us the closing remarks and the vote of thanks. You are muted, Professor Kacheni.
Yeah, I was saying I have a tendency, instead of closing, of opening again. So let me try to close. Thank you so much for the generous offering, Professor Ramakondo. And thank you so much to the participants and to the conversations which we have. You actually was generous in your delivery of what you wanted us to get. And I think it was delivered in a very good spirit, that you spoke really from the heart and the mind. You didn't do the Cartesian idea of removing yourself from this. And we thank you so much for that. And the other beauty of what you did is that you constantly said, my paper, we need that paper. Thank you so much. Good night to those where it is night, and good afternoon to others, and a good morning to others. Thank you so much. We appreciate your coming to this space and for engaging in the debates which we're having. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next one, 25th August.
True. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Siyabonga.
Yabonga. I owe you something, Professor Kachene. I'll send tonight what I promised.
Okay.
Yes.
I remember. I still remember.
Yes, yeah. I'll send it to you tonight. Thank you very much. This was wonderful. Yeah.
Christine, you are now Linda today. He doesn't hear me.
No, she's muted over there. Yeah. This was
it's difficult doing these hybrid things, Sabela. I don't know which camera to look at, but I will see you soon.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
bye.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ramagundo. It was a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much.